Professor Sanders walked through Camp Persistence with his hands folded behind his back and his attention fixed on the people around him. The camp had changed considerably since their arrival. What had once been a ramshackle collection of crude lean-tos and panic-built shelters had become something far more deliberate. The walls stood straighter now. Roofs no longer sagged under their own weight. The newer structures were built from cleaner timber and properly cut beams, the sort of incremental improvement that only came once people started gaining levels and skills that translated into practical competence. It was still primitive, certainly, but no longer haphazard. It was becoming a functional settlement. A group of armed guards moved through the center of camp carrying the butchered remains of some scaled swamp creature between them. Fresh blood dripped from the carcass into the packed dirt as they hauled it toward the cook fires. Nearby, another group was preparing to leave through the gates, foragers with baskets, knives, and sacks slung over their shoulders, each escorted by 2 armed guards. Dedicated hunters and gatherers, organized into a rudimentary but effective division of labor. Professor Sanders approved. There was no reason for him to leave Camp Persistence. Beyond the walls were monsters, mud, and unnecessary risk. Within them was safety, food, and an abundance of variables worth studying. The camp itself was a far more interesting subject than the swamp beyond it, and unlike the swamp, it did not attempt to devour him for his curiosity. So he stayed. There was plenty to observe here, and observation, much to his satisfaction, still earned experience. The sun was high overhead, warm and bright through the gaps in the canopy. It would have been a beautiful day if not for the sharpened palisades, butcher tables, and armed watchmen. Even so, there was something almost offensively pleasant about this place. And that, more than anything else, irritated him. The people were wrong. Not outwardly, but in the way they behaved. Professor Sanders had spent too many years around stressed students, anxious administrators, and sleep-deprived researchers to mistake true relief for placid compliance. Before finding Camp Persistence, some of these people had survived weeks of violence and constant threats from what dwelled outside. They should have been volatile, tired, and irritable. There were well over 100 people in the camp now, armed, exhausted, and crammed into close quarters. There should have been at least some fights about one thing or another. Petty disputes over food, labor, and space. Yet, there were none. No real arguments or any sign of real conflict. People barely even raised their voices. And when tension did begin to rise, Richard always seemed to appear. Professor Sanders had seen it several times now. 2 people in the middle of a disagreement, voices tightening, tempers beginning to rise, then Richard would appear, calm and quietly attentive, and the argument would simply stop. Their irritation bled away with unnatural ease. Richard would speak, offer direction, and both parties would just comply with his words. Perhaps it was the safety of the walls. Perhaps collective security did more to stabilize behavior than he was inclined to believe. It was possible. Unlikely, but possible. Either way, Professor Sanders intended to find out what made Camp Persistence so remarkably placid. He turned toward the healing shack. Unlike the rest of the camp, it had changed very little structurally. The building was barely more substantial than when they had arrived. The interior, however, had improved considerably. Professor Sanders stepped inside and was immediately hit by the pungent smell of medicinal herbs. It smelled like a skunk had died in a barrel of diesel. Drying plants hung from the rafters in tied bundles. Crushed leaves, poultices, and steeping mixtures covered a long table beside bandages, some of which had been received as rewards from the system. At first glance, it looked like primitive medicine, but upon closer inspection, advanced analysis revealed that each remedy carried potent healing properties. His skill had proven useful for more than theory over the past several weeks. Identify could provide names and broad classifications, but advanced analysis revealed medicinal properties, toxicity, and preparation methods. Camp Persistence relied on him to evaluate unfamiliar plants, fungi, and herbs harvested from the swamp. Amanda looked up from where she sat grinding herbs into paste. "Professor Sanders," she said. "Checking in on Kyle. Have you seen Sage or Nadine?" Professor Sanders asked. "I was looking for them, and Brian asked me to check on Kyle while I was here. I haven't seen either of them since the fire last night." Amanda glanced toward the back of the shack, where Kyle lay asleep beneath a blanket, pale but no longer at death's door. "I haven't seen them today," she said. "But Kyle's over there. I've been keeping him sedated for his own safety. The last time he woke up, he started ranting and insisting he was fine, then he tried to leave like losing a leg was only a minor inconvenience." Professor Sanders nodded once. And the leg? Amanda's expression tightened. The tissue around what remains has been healed for a few days now, and my skill has removed any risk of infection. But, she exhaled softly. I don't think I can restore the limb. Maybe at level 20. If I'm lucky, there might be a skill that can regrow lost limbs. Amanda set the mortar aside. Would be easier if I could level faster. Hard to level a healing class when people rarely get hurt. Even the guards and hunters are careful when they go out. Professor Sanders allowed himself a faint smile. One of the many advantages of being a scientist in this system-run world is that there is no shortage of things worth studying. Amanda snorted softly. Professor Sanders stepped further inside and let his gaze drift over the herbs and makeshift tools spread throughout the room. I have been level 19 for some time now, he said. I suspect I will reach 20 within the next day or two. Amanda gave him a flat look. Must be nice. It is, Professor Sanders said. Amanda rolled her eyes, but he ignored it. It was not arrogance if one was correct. His eyes drifted toward the far wall, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. Mana remains the more interesting problem, he said. Amanda sighed the long-suffering sigh of someone who already knew she was about to be used as an intellectual sounding board. Professor Sanders took that as encouragement. We know it originates from the system core, he said. We know it regenerates naturally over time. We know stamina does as well. What we do not know is where the core acquires the energy to produce either. Professor Sanders continued. Mana and stamina are not infinite. They are generated. Which means the core is converting something into usable energy. He glanced at her. The question is what? Amanda frowned. Food. Professor Sanders gave her a look. Amanda shrugged. It was a guess. A poor one, he said, and continued before she could object. If mana were derived strictly from caloric intake, we would see direct fluctuation tied to food consumption. We do not, at least not yet. Starvation weakens the body, certainly, but mana regeneration persists from what I have observed. Amanda resumed grinding herbs, more to give her hands something to do than out of real necessity. So what's your hypothesis then, Professor? He turned back toward her. Either the core is drawing from some ambient environmental source, converting an internal substrate we have yet to identify, or accessing an external reservoir entirely. Amanda stared at him for a moment. You've been thinking about this a lot. Professor Sanders gave her a flat look. Obviously. Amanda snorted. He let the silence sit for a moment, then shifted topics. There is another problem I've been considering. Amanda sighed. Right, because what could possibly be more fascinating than listening to you theorize about mana? On the contrary, Professor Sanders said. You should find it very interesting. Amanda set the pestle down. All right. What is it? Professor Sanders' gaze drifted toward the open doorway. He walked over and closed the door before returning to her. Camp persistence. Amanda frowned slightly. More specifically, he said, why camp persistence is so safe. Amanda folded her arms. Because it has walls, guards, and enough people to keep things running. A surface-level answer, Professor Sanders said. Not an incorrect one. Merely incomplete. Amanda gave him a look, but Professor Sanders continued anyway. Do you remember the contract we signed when we first arrived? Amanda frowned. Vaguely. Professor Sanders allowed himself the faintest flicker of satisfaction. Of course he remembered it word for word. Naturally. I remember the exact wording, he said. Amanda looked unimpressed. Of course you do. Professor Sanders ignored that and recited from memory. By entering into this binding agreement, you consent to the following terms, enforced by the authority of the system. While you are recognized as a member of Camp Persistence, you shall not cause harm, injury, or death whether directly or indirectly to another member of the camp. Violation of this pact shall incur system-enforced punishment proportional to the harm inflicted, to be measured and mirrored upon the perpetrator. This contract is non-transferable, automatically active upon acceptance, and shall remain in effect for the duration of your membership within Camp Persistence and for 48 hours following your departure. By signing below, you have accepted these terms. Amanda stared at him for a beat, then frowned. I don't remember it sounding that harsh. Professor Sanders' eyes narrowed slightly. I did not think it to be harsh at first either, he said. Amanda shifted against the table. It still sounds like just a safety contract. Don't hurt people, don't start problems, Don't stab anyone. That, Professor Sanders said, is what I thought at first too. He paused, then added more carefully, it is also a remarkably dangerous piece of language. Amanda arched a brow. That seems dramatic. It is precise. He began pacing again. The issue is not that it forbids violence. That would be reasonable. The issue is that it forbids harm. Amanda frowned. That's basically the same thing. No, Professor Sanders said. It is not. He turned toward her. Violence is specific. Harm is interpretive. Amanda opened her mouth, then stopped as Professor Sanders continued. If I strike you, that is violence. Clear and direct and easily measured. He raised one finger. If I mishandle supplies and ruin a week's worth of food, I have not attacked anyone. I have, however, indirectly caused harm. Amanda's expression shifted. Professor Sanders raised a second finger. If a guard neglects their post and someone dies because of it, indirect harm. A third. If a healer fails to save someone they might have been able to treat. Amanda grimaced. Indirect harm. Precisely. Professor Sanders lowered his hand. The wording is catastrophically broad. Broad enough to encompass negligence, refusal, error, and incompetence. Amanda frowned more deeply now. Professor Sanders clasped his hands behind his back again. Now imagine someone leaves. Be it a hunter or a guard. Their absence increases labor burden, reduces output, and introduces risk. He tilted his head slightly. If their departure contributes to food shortage or reduced security, one could argue they have indirectly caused harm. Amanda stared at him for a long moment. That feels like a stretch. Professor Sanders' mouth twitched faintly. No, he said. It feels intentional. Amanda crossed her arms over her chest. You think Richard wrote it like that? Professor Sanders considered that for a moment. I think Richard either understood its utility immediately, he said, or simply did not question it. Amanda did not seem particularly comforted by that. She looked toward the closed door, then back at him. Then why would anyone sign it? Why did we sign it? Professor Sanders answered without hesitation. Because when we arrived, we were tired, had just suffered a defeat from a lord of the swamp, and were standing inside a defended wall being offered safety. Amanda's expression shifted slightly. Under those conditions, Professor Sanders continued, most people do not scrutinize legal phrasing. They look for shelter and safety, just like we did. Amanda frowned, gaze drifting slightly as she thought back. I remember reading it, she said slowly. Or most of it. Her brow furrowed. I remember thinking it was strict, but, she hesitated. Not like that. Professor Sanders stilled. That was interesting. Amanda noticed the shift. What? Professor Sanders' eyes narrowed slightly. You remember the impression, he said. Not the wording. Amanda frowned. I guess. And the impression is softer than the language itself. Amanda hesitated. Maybe. Professor Sanders felt something cold settle neatly into place behind his thoughts. Amanda had forgotten the severity of the wording but retained the intended emotional conclusion. The edge had been sanded off. The threat remained, but only in the abstract. Enough to guide behavior but not enough to provoke scrutiny. Interesting. Very interesting. Amanda gave him a wary look. Professor Sanders. He blinked once and let the thought go. My apologies, he said. I was lost in thought. Amanda snorted softly. Dangerous habit. For most people, Professor Sanders said. Yes. That earned him a reluctant smile. I am not suggesting immediate malice, he said. Merely that camp persistence might be more coercive than it appears. Amanda studied him for a moment, then sighed. That sounds like your way of saying something is wrong, but you don't know what yet. Professor Sanders allowed himself a faint smile. Yes, he said as he turned towards the door. That is exactly what I mean. One last question before I go, he said, turning back around. Amanda gestured for him to continue. Professor Sanders studied her for a moment before asking, have you noticed anything unusual when Richard is nearby? Amanda thought for several seconds before she shook her head. No, she said. Not really. He just seems capable. Professor Sanders said nothing. Amanda frowned slightly, searching for the right words. He is quiet, calm, and he solves problems. He keeps this place organized. Keeps things moving. She gave a small shrug. Honestly? We're lucky we found this place when we did. Weird contract or not, I'd rather be here than out in the swamp getting eaten. Professor Sanders inclined his head. On that point, he said, we are in complete agreement. He offered Amanda a polite nod before he opened the door and stepped back out into the sunlight. The warmth of the sun was almost offensive after the medicinal reek of the healing shack. Professor Sanders stepped back into the open air and paused, letting the heat settle across his face as his eyes adjusted to the light. Camp Persistence bustled around him in the same quiet rhythm it always had. People moved with purpose. Work was done. Meals were prepared. Repairs and construction continued. The camp functioned with the smooth predictability of a machine whose parts had all accepted their roles. But if he were honest with himself, figuring out the mana mystery was more interesting. He walked slowly, one hand resting against the black notebook at his side as his thoughts turned inward toward the system core in his abdomen. Mana came from it. That much was obvious. He could feel it regenerate. He could feel it move within him. Feel it drain when he used his advanced analysis skill and refill over time. But where did the core acquire the energy to produce it? Food remained an unsatisfactory answer. That was too mundane for this new reality. Mana replenished even when caloric intake was poor. Slower perhaps, but not enough to support direct metabolic conversion. Which meant the core was doing something else. Drawing from somewhere. Converting something he didn't understand into a form of energy he also didn't understand. Not yet at least. Professor Sanders' thoughts narrowed around the problem as he walked, attention half on the camp and half on the impossible core seated beneath his ribs. If the core drew from an external source, then mana was not simply stored energy. It was processed energy. And if it was processed, someone stepped into his path. The impact caught him off balance. Professor Sanders stumbled, one foot slipping against the packed dirt before he went down hard. His palm struck stone and scraped open in a hot flare of pain. He hissed sharply and looked up. Richard stood over him, calm as ever, perfectly composed. For one quick instant, Professor Sanders' pulse spiked. Had he just caused Richard harm? What was about to happen to him? Richard smiled. Vikram, he said, voice smooth and inviting. Are you all right? Something warm and slick passed over Professor Sanders' thoughts as Richard spoke, smoothing over the sharper edges. Professor Sanders was already pushing himself upright. Yes, he said quickly. Quite all right. Sorry, I was distracted. I didn't mean to run into you. Richard's gaze flicked once to the blood on Professor Sanders' palm. Of course, Richard said. Accidents happen. Do be more careful, Vikram. We would hate for someone to get hurt. Professor Sanders inclined his head once. Quite. Richard's placid smile never shifted as he turned and continued on as though nothing had happened. Professor Sanders stood still for several seconds after Richard left. Then he resumed walking, more careful this time. His palm stung. His pulse remained elevated. And beneath both, something colder had begun to settle into place. Suspicion. As he walked, Professor Sanders pressed inward against his system core, feeling for its familiar shape. He had discovered some time ago that even when his mana was full, the core could be coaxed into releasing more if pressed in just the right way. Just a little extra. He pressed inward, and his mana stirred. A thin current rose from his core and flowed through his channels, sharp and clean as it climbed toward his mind. It washed across his thoughts like cold water. The moment it did, Professor Sanders stopped walking, his brow furrowing. He had not walked into Richard. He had been moving in a straight line and Richard had stepped backward into him. Professor Sanders turned slowly, looking back across the camp. The scrape on his palm throbbed, yet Richard had received no backlash. There had been no visible punishment for the harm he had caused. Richard had undoubtedly caused harm. Minor harm, certainly, but harm nonetheless. And yet the contract had done nothing. Something here did not add up.